of all, thank you for taking time, have a little discussion about kind of what in-season nitrogen management looks like for us. We've done this for a number of years now. We've kind of split applications up just a little bit, and so wanted to get your input just a little bit on how to best manage that during a season like this, and particularly as we think about this season, increases in nitrogen costs, first of all. That's a big one. Decreases in what margins look like, profit margins look like in budgets. And so how are we going to kind of tie those two things together? And so I guess my first question to you was, tell me a little bit about what you're maybe hearing maybe from the retail side, the farmer side, what you're hearing out in the country about how things are sounding from the standpoint of what guys are thinking about maybe doing, and also what you're hearing about supply.
Yes, thank you, David. This is a really important conversation for sure with the challenges we have this year. And like you mentioned, of course, a lot of the discussion and a lot of what I hear is really related to how do we maybe make some adjustments, right, to the program that we maybe have, that we've been using over the years, given the price issues with fertilizer, in some cases even supply, right? And of course, you and I here, we're going to talk more about the agronomics and what we can do there. There are things that basically things that we are not able to control, right? And so that's really the supply side of things, and the price, which is just out of our control. But the question is there anything we can do to increase efficiency or maybe cut back on rates, and what are the opportunities? And I think we do have some things that we can do for sure, and we need to be thinking about those things.
So we have done, I guess, a fair bit, as I kind of alluded to earlier. We've kind of switch to programs that are maybe obviously front-loaded from an anhydrous standpoint in the fall, typically. As we can get a better price then. We've typically gone that route. And then come back with anywhere from 30, 40, maybe 50 pounds of nitrogen. So I guess from your standpoint, talk a little bit about those programs, and do you feel like that fall anhydrous, especially in a year like this one where we seem like we had a bit of an extended fall, maybe we're warm through the winter.
Right.
And where does that put us from the standpoint? Do you have any fears about what that did from the standpoint of that nitrogen that's out there?
That's always a concern, right? Because we're putting that nitrogen very early, and we have a fall like this year which is warmer, and we always question, right, whether we lost some of that nitrogen, or what is the risk. We have some warm temperatures. We have, nitrification happening at that point, and then we have some heavy rains, in recent days that maybe put some of that nitrogen at risk, and that's always a challenge with that fall application, right? And so that's always going to be a concern. Obviously, we have things that we need to be thinking about, soil temperature, using inhibitors if all possible, especially for some of that early fall. Those are things that can help us, but the risk is going to be there. And so to your question about in recent years moving a little bit more with in-season, I really do like that approach, right? And there's always going to be pros and cons on this. And again, this year we need to keep in mind the price. Obviously, those who maybe put anhydrous last fall actually got a better price situation and actually in better shape from that standpoint. Now, the price today is not very good. But we're thinking about split application in general. That's always going to tend to be more agronomically efficient, right? Because again, we are not putting all the risks, especially front-loaded, putting that risk of losing that nitrogen early. Now we're splitting the nitrogen, and we're putting that nitrogen when the crop's going to need it. That's right. That's very basic, right? We're thinking about that nitrogen uptake curve in corn, when that's going to happen, and the timing of that. The closer we can get to that point, it's always going to be more efficient. And so I do like that. Of course, there are things that we need to think about this year with the prices and everything, but again, what are the implications in terms of potential savings maybe there? If we are increasing efficiency, are we maybe potentially producing more with less nitrogen? Now the economics, still may look pretty good from that standpoint. So.
What do you think from the standpoint, if you were to be able to put a percentage on it or any value, can you do that from the standpoint of maybe fall applied versus early spring versus more in season? How does that efficiency change? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, we actually do have several studies looking at those combinations, and this is always a little tricky because I mentioned earlier we're talking about risk of losing, right?
Right.
And there could be a year where it makes no difference at all, because we just don't have any losses, and that, fall anhydrous, is just as good as anything else, right? But then we have some of those years when we do have some of those losses, and that's where you see the effect. So I always tend to say when we're talking about looking at some of these comparisons in management, we really need to be looking at multi-year, right? It's very difficult to really say, okay, well, based on 1 or 2 years, this is going to be better than the other one, because of course, changes in environment and every year is different. Again, we're talking about 5 years or even 5 or 10 years in average. That's where we see some of these improved systems like split application in season start to make some gains. What percent we're talking about here? We've done some of the data we have for 10-year average. We can easily see about 10% increase in efficiency in average.
Okay.
And over some of the studies we have is more than 10 years that start to look at some of those numbers. Again, if you're looking at some individual years, sometimes you don't see anything.
Right.
But again, you may got a few years here and there where you really start to see that difference. And so the question then is, I guess, well, a year like this, we really worry because the price is pretty high. And so we're saying, okay, well, what about this year? Well, in general, we probably should be doing that better management every year anyways, right, regardless of the price situation. Again, this year, where the situation that we have fall, maybe warmer winter months, it is, very likely that we have more nitrification that happen compared to other years, and so there's more risk of potentially losing, and that combined with high fertilizer prices, again, that becomes really that impact potential for improved efficiency with in-season, I think, can be pretty significant.
So in theory, I guess, how close do you really would be kind of an optimum time frame to put any upfront nitrogen? We're putting on a lot in the fall, as we kind of alluded to, even early winter. Mm-hmm. How close do we want to try to put that to that crop to maybe get the highest rate of efficiency?
Situation that we have fall, maybe warmer winter months, it is, very likely that we have more nitrification that happen compared to other years, and so there's more risk of potentially losing, and that combined with high fertilizer prices, again, that becomes really that impact potential for improved efficiency with in-season, I think, can be pretty significant.
So in theory, I guess, how close do you really would be kind of an optimum time frame to put any upfront nitrogen? We're putting on a lot in the fall, as we kind of alluded to, even early winter. Mm-hmm. How close do we want to try to put that to that crop to maybe get the highest rate of efficiency?
Yeah, and that's a very good question, because it's also a balance, right? We don't want to be putting too much late that it becomes just too late, right? And we actually do have some studies where we have studies where we did 100% citrus. We didn't do anything pre-planned or anything, and we went and put everything, around V4, V6, where if you look at the nitrogen uptake in corn, there's still not much nitrogen taken up at that point at all, right? Mm-hmm. However, some of that data actually shows that we are getting some penalty, because even though we don't need a lot of nitrogen that early, we still need enough nitrogen for that establishment and getting that corn going early on. So if we have even a little bit of suffering, deficiency going on, even, in the first, V4, V6, if that corn is suffering at that point, we're already losing some yield potential there. Right. And so we need to have that nitrogen up front. So what is the ideal time? Of course, having said that, I think the ideal time obviously is we need to have something pre-planned. As close as possible to planting time is always better, right? Because again, we're talking about fall, we're really talking of several months that maybe that nitrogen sitting there with the risk of some losses, and obviously mineralization happening, conversion to nitrate. And we have to remember that the main risk here is really the nitrate, right? And so we're putting in hydrous ammonia, that's going to be ammonium, it's going to be there stable, but that converting to nitrate, once it's in the nitrate form, that's where we may have some of the leaching, denitrification and potential losses. So that's why that time makes a difference. And so if we're putting spring apply, again, like I say, for example, one system that I really like is like March anhydrous, for example. That's a pretty good system because, again, we're putting fairly close to when we're going to be planting corn, that corn's going to use it, and still we're putting in a form that nitrogen is stable, right? It's going to be there, it's in the ammonium form, we are not risking losing that, and then pretty soon that corn's going to be taken up. And so again, that's really ideal, right? And then we talk about split application and in season in particular. And in the case of in season, it's a logistic question, right? How are we going to do that? We want to put that nitrogen when it's needed. And if you think about it, about V8, V10, that's really where things start to take up significant amount of nitrogen. But in many cases, at that point, we're really trying to catch up. So we have to be careful with that as well. We don't want to be too late, and that's always my concern. We want to be supplying that nitrogen, but once that nitrogen uptake is happening pretty quickly, we may struggle to catch up if we are relying too heavy on in-season application. So I really like to have heavier pre-plan and continue to kind of spoon feed the additional nitrogen in season. I think that's maybe the ideal balance.
Okay. So we have had a fairly dry winter, a fairly warm winter across at least most of Northeast Kansas. Based on those programs, maybe the fall program versus the March program that you were maybe talking about would be more ideal for an anhydrous application program. How do you feel about recent rains? How are those two programs differentially affected by big rains like we've had recently? I mean, we've had anywhere from 1.5 inches to 5.5 inches, even greater amounts across parts of Northeast Kansas over the last 3 or 4 weeks.
And that's exactly, David, that's a situation where these two programs will make a difference, right? We're talking those fall apply anhydrous that maybe already some of that nitrogen is in the nitrate form. Quite a bit of that is maybe already in the nitrate form, just sitting there, right? And the moment you get water, leaching or moving there, that nitrogen is mobile. It's going to move with the water, right? And worse, actually, if we do have, again, some water standing there, again, that nitrate form is going to be subject to potential losses. On the flip side, something that we just put in March, for example, most of that nitrogen will still be in the ammonium form. The anhydrous is going to be there in the ammonium form. And nitrogen in the ammonium form is not subject to losses. Again, it's not mobile, so it's not going to leach. If we have flooding, for example, that ammonium is going to stay there. It's not going to convert to anything because we need oxygen for that conversion to happen. So it's going to be stable in the anaerobic condition situation. So again, those two situations where you have, again, quite a bit of the anhydrous already converted to nitrate, losses can happen. Again, the situation where we apply maybe spring application of anhydrous, and I will say most of that nitrogen, if not 100% of that nitrogen, maybe still in the ammonium form, is not going to be subject to losses. So that's the contrast we have here. And again, this depends on the environment. Like you say, this year we just have warmer conditions, right? Some years where we have soil temperatures and very low temperature in the winter months, that obviously going to be more stable nitrogen. And so that's the difference there.
You mentioned that, I mean, we probably have nitrogen programs that span kind of those months, fall to March timeframe. So talk about a little bit, how do we come up with a good nitrogen rate for in this season? We obviously don't want to, we're going to have to depend somewhat on, we hope we have some still left out there, but as we go through this season, how do we start to design a nitrogen management program from this point forward to make sure that we're getting on what we need out there? What does that look like? What should a grower be looking like? Is that just formula based? We're going to automatically apply this amount. Should we be thinking about tissue testing? Should we be thinking about some other tools? How do we go about doing that?
That's an excellent question. And one thing I also want to emphasize, the conversation we're having is really on, how we can increase the agronomic efficiency. Of course, we understand that there's going to be logistics involved with this as well, right? Some things that can be done, and some producers can do better at one thing, others say, well, that just doesn't work for me. Right. So that needs to be part of the conversation, and each producer, will have to consider the the options available. But to the question of how do we define what's the optimum rate and how we go about that, I really think it needs to be a combination of pieces of information that we have. I really don't think that there's going to be a single, formula or a single approach that's going to give you exactly, okay, this is the best rate. Having said that, I think that's one of the things that we need to keep in mind. You mentioned things like soil and tissue analysis and looking at yield history and formulas that we've been using over the years. I think those combination of things we have to take into account. For sure, we have to keep in mind nitrogen needs to come from somewhere, right? So by default, that yield potential is going to be a key component, right? If we do have a yield potential, we do have a history of yield potential, well, that's going to be the first step to say, okay, this is ballpark where we need to be, right? Based on formulas that we have. Along with that, we know that another key source of nitrogen source is going to be organic matter, right? So we need to have information on soil tests that, okay, this is where we are in organic matter. This is how much nitrogen potentially we can expect to come. So we need to get that information as well. In some cases, we need to be looking at residual nitrogen. In some cases, we have lower than expected yield, or there's some history there that maybe indicate that we have some extra nitrogen sitting there. We need to know that. In a year like this is actually the year to find out about that. And so those are the key things. But again, my point is that I don't think there's one single piece of information. I think we all need to be looking at different pieces of information, and of course bringing all of that together for each different fields that we're managing, and based on the experience also that the farmer, the producer is having in that particular field. They are familiar with kind of what to expect in terms of potential mineralization and management, and that's how we develop that sort of where we know we are optimum agronomic nitrogen, right? And so, but then how do we apply that nitrogen, right? That's maybe the main question, and that's where things like, again, tissue analysis can be quite the excellent tool that we can use in a year like this. Especially we're thinking about, we started talking early on about split application. If we're decided we didn't put 100% of the nitrogen last fall or this spring, and we're saying we're going to come back and do a side trace based on the needs, well, that's where tissue analysis is going to tell us where we are, right? It's going to tell us, we maybe need more nitrogen, we can put that extra nitrogen. It could also be the case that, this is just the year that we have just additional mineralization of nitrogen coming from organic matter, right? So we don't need to go back and put that extra nitrogen in season. So how do we figure that out? Again, tissue analysis is one option, right? And there are other tools today too. We talk about, sensors, that's been, satellite image or drones that can be used for these as well. Again, the practicality and how that's going to work for each farmer is a little bit different, but those tools are out there that can give us an idea what's the situation in season to pull the trigger and decide whether or not we need to put more nitrogen or not. And so that's I think is the key here. Again, as we going into the season, I think we need to have an idea where we need to be in terms of nitrogen. And be prepared to maybe save some nitrogen if we can in season. But again, that's be ready to make that kind of decisions. Tissue analysis is something that we don't use a lot, but there's huge potential. There's costs associated with that, right?
Right.
But again, what is the cost of a tissue analysis versus the implication of potential savings on nitrogen fertilizer this year? I'm pretty sure that's going to pay.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
This year, it always pays, but I think in a year like this, it's going to be even more important.
So talk specifically about, from a tissue sampling standpoint, we're going to pull tissue samples out there. When should we be doing that? How should we be doing that? We need to be doing it in a time frame that we can get samples to the lab and back so that we can get a number. We need to be doing it in a way so that sample is actually good when it gets to the lab. So talk about what that timing looks like and what some of those practices might be to optimize that so we can really utilize that the best we can.
Yeah, so early season, in that window about around V6, V4 to V8 or so is one of the key timings where we can do tissue analysis. We typically at that point recommend the entire plant, right? Cut it right around the surface of the soil. We recommend that to put in paper bags that will allow for that plant to start drying, because that's typically what happens once that sample get to the lab. We'll dry that sample and grind it and do the analysis. And so it's very important that it is in paper bags. We put it in Ziploc bags. Sometimes that that humidity and then obviously the sample is no longer good for analysis. So paper bags, again, that timing around V6, the whole plant. Try to shake any soils that may be contaminating that sample. Doesn't have to be super clean, but again, just any excess sample, and send it to any lab. Any labs. K-State has a lab, obviously, but any commercial labs would be appropriate. One thing that I will say is that you mentioned a key point there, timing, right? Because
yes.
we need to get this information quickly and be able to make decisions. One thing that changed a lot in recent years is that labs are really, really fast in getting those results back.
Right.
In part because everything is electronic, and once you get to the lab, like for example, K-State lab, we'll get the samples today. We'll put it to the dryer, analyze that next day. By the end of the next day, results are ready in the email, right? And so we're talking typically 2 days in the lab, and obviously again, shipping is pretty much overnight everywhere.
Right.
And so seems to me like that changed quite a bit in recent years, because we always worry, it's not fast enough. Well, again, we're talking a couple days, right? That's really what it takes, 2, maybe 3 days at the most. And so it is much faster. So that's one critical time, right? At that point, obviously, we know where we are. We can make decisions in terms of in-season application. Another timing is also when you're getting close to VT growth stages, R1, VT, R1, tassel, getting the ear leaves and submitting those for analysis. That's another timing. Especially we're thinking about later, maybe flying and providing some extra nitrogen later on. And we may say, well, but that's pretty late, right? VT, R1.
Right.
Well, if you think about the nitrogen uptake, we still have about 25% of the nitrogen that needs to be taken up after tassel. Okay. So that's still pretty
high amount,
significant, pretty high amount. And so if we're finding out that, we kind of sort of running out of nitrogen at that point, that could be an opportunity, if we can fly urea, apply urea or something like that, to complement that additional nitrogen. That could be another critical time. And so we need to be thinking about that nitrogen uptake curve. What are some of those critical points? Like I mentioned, V6, V8 or so. That's right before that rapid nitrogen uptake that's going to happen. Make sure we have the nitrogen there, and if we can supplement nitrogen at that point, that would be a critical time. And then later on, making sure as we're getting into that reproductive grain formation, filling grain and reproductive stage, do we have that nitrogen to carry everything to the end, right? Or are we running out of nitrogen? And typically that's, again, I want to just emphasize that a little bit more, because it seems like we always say, well, tassel, that's just already too late, right? In many cases, we don't see any issues with nitrogen until we get to that point, because we have enough early on, right? But then suddenly we run out of nitrogen. And at that point, sometimes we don't even see it anymore.
Right.
We don't worry about it, but that corn may be suffering of nitrogen deficiency. And again, close to about 25% of nitrogen uptake still is happening after VT. And so that's quite significant.
So if we can get out there for those programs that are maybe front-loaded, like what many of ours are, that as long as we have an emerged ear leaf, that's a time when we need to be at tassel, right at tassel. We need to be thinking about
and we have
sampling
that
then.
ear leaf. That will be a time to assess. And again, I'm talking tissue analysis, but also just kind of paying attention to what's happening to that crop, right? Again, we don't get into that crop field as easy anymore, and we don't get to see as much. But we need to be paying attention, because it's, like I say, it's not uncommon that in many cases, if you were sure of nitrogen, that's where you're going to see it. Right. You're not going to see it necessarily early on, because you're going to have enough. But as you're getting to that reproductive stage, we may run out of nitrogen. And again, that will be a situation. And we've done some studies, so that's your question, right? Okay, what if we go a VT or so and put a shot of nitrogen? Is that going to do any good? And yes, there are some considerations. Of course, we need to have that nitrogen incorporate somehow, so that you have to have rain or irrigation for that nitrogen to move into the root zone. But we've done some studies whether or not that's still benefiting the corn crop, and yes, it does benefit the corn crop, especially against situations where we essentially run out of nitrogen. We need that extra nitrogen, and if we are able to supply that at that time, yes, that corn will benefit from it, from that application. So that is something else to think about as we think in the entire season as well. And again, we're talking about tight budgets, and especially if we decided this year that, we maybe cut back a little bit early on, and we're really going to be more active in terms of managing in season. We need to be looking at early season and also mid and late season.
So in some cases, we might be a little bit tempted to, well, it's maybe not quite tassel, but I want to make sure I get this on. We maybe go a little bit earlier than that, sample a little bit earlier. Is there a risk? Is there a problem with the results that you would get?
No, it's
earlier maybe.
No, it's not necessarily. That can be done. One of the things that you have to keep in mind also, how do we determine if, based on tissue analysis, whether something is optimum or is deficient? What we use essentially, we compare this to what a healthy plant would look like.
Okay.
Right? And so we know that concentration of nitrogen in the corn is changing during the growing season. Right?
Yes, right.
And so that's just because the plant is growing, and so the concentration that you see at V6 naturally will be different than what you see at VT. And so as long as we have good comparison, that's fine, right? We can go earlier, but we need to make sure and clarify what's the growth stage of that. Because in the lab, if they think this is a VT or R1 growth stage, they're going to be comparing to that growth stage. And again, like I say, those are naturally different concentrations. So we need to make sure we identify what's that growth stage. Because again, that concentration is changing all the time during the growing season.
And do we feel like we have good book values, if you will, what an ideal plant is from that early all the way up through?
Yes, we do. Yes, we do.
So we've got good comparison.
We do have comparisons, and I would say again, it's the best comparison for sure is going to be that early season V6 or so, and then your leaves later. Those are going to be the best ones. And again, depending on the lab and so on, there will be also references for, and we do have values for other growth stages that we can compare these. Yes. Just to add to this, I guess one thing that is also important to keep in mind, we talk about tools. One thing that we haven't touched about this a little, not yet, but we done in some crops is to look at reference strips, right? This is the other thing that you can do also is that, if you do have an area where there's plenty of nitrogen and what is expected in terms of nitrogen concentration, you can use that as your reference healthy plan, right? Okay. And so you can do that yourself. I mean, you can rely on the book values that the lab is providing, but you can have your own reference in the field as well. Mm-hmm. In other words, if you have your spot there that you know there's going to be, maybe you put double the nitrogen or whatever, and that's healthy, healthy corn with plenty of nitrogen, you can sample that, and then you get your other sample in the field and compare those numbers. If the rest of the field is doing fine, those numbers will be very similar. And of course, if the rest of the bulk of the field is getting deficient, then that comparison is going to start to show. Right. And so by doing that, then you don't have to worry too much about the growth stage, because you can do that all the time. Mm-hmm.
Compare those anytime through the season.
Anytime during the season, yes, because you are comparing the same growth stages, the same variety, the same hybrids, everything the same. Only difference is that one of them is happy, plenty of nitrogen. The other one you're monitoring and make sure it's doing okay.
Okay. Right? So. What does that strip look like? I mean, what do you think that strip looks like in a field? How do you go about setting those types of things up?
Yeah, it should be very easy. Again, we don't want to make it complicated either. I mean, keep it as simple as possible. I mean, this is an area that you have access to it, and you can get to that spot in the field. Most important thing is really that making sure that has plenty of nitrogen, right? And so I typically say double the rate that you're putting, you're thinking of putting everywhere, and we're talking small spot that you can do that. You can even apply by hand, whatever. You can go back and apply additional nitrogen if you need. Make sure that's always going to be there. It's going to be that for sure is going to be sufficient in nitrogen.
Right.
I wouldn't make that too complicated.
Okay.
Right? Again, if we're going to get into things like using that reference strip for satellite or drone image, of course that's going to require maybe more, right? Maybe we're talking an entire strip that's going to go across the field. That is something that you can discuss with agronomists or whoever is doing that, right? Mm-hmm. So that can be a little bit more elaborate, but you can start very, very simple, right? With just this one area that has plenty of nitrogen and use that as a reference.
Whether you're doing it through the season or whether you're kind of even waiting just a one shot, I'm going to walk into this field and kind of see it though, that tasseling type time period is pretty important, whether you're doing satellite imagery, whether you're doing drone imagery, whether you're scouting, whatever you're doing. That's when you want to make your comparison so that you can make sure and have some time to get product on.
Yes, that's the other question. That's a very good point. How late can you go, right?
Right.
And that is, to me, that's really probably the latest I will consider.
Okay.
Yeah. After that is just I think we've done some studies where we went after tassel later on, and it's just we don't see much value anymore at that point. It's just becoming less and less because again the corn obviously continue to develop, and at some point what you can rescue is just very it's not there anymore.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So tissue sampling, obviously an important part of it. Let's talk about a couple other things that maybe we would consider as well. Some states talk about in-season soil sampling, in-season nitrate sampling during the season. Tell us how that works and whether that's a good practice or not a good practice.
Yeah. One that's fairly common use actually when I was in Iowa, that's something that we done quite a bit, is the pre-side dress nitrate test. Essentially, it's in season around V6 or so. We are collecting a 12-inch soil sample for nitrate. That is one thing that the idea of that particular test is to give you a better assessment of what kind of nitrogen mineralization is happening from organic matter.
Okay.
Right? And based on that information, then we make a decision on side dressing.
Okay.
So that's really the sign for in season.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's really the goal there, is to have an assessment on organic matter mineralization. And places like Iowa, right, there's so much organic matter,
right,
and there's so much of the nitrogen is coming from organic matter. That has a lot more value. I think especially for us in say northeast Kansas, we do have also a lot of potential value for something like that because of the type of soils we have and the conditions. And so that's another approach. That's something I will definitely consider as well, especially if we want to have a better idea of what's coming from organic matter. Because again, if you're using some of the formulas, for example, and assumptions about how much is coming from organic matter, we know those are averages, right?
Right.
And that's always a challenge, right? Because we use these formulas and these are averages, but that's going to be fluctuating every year. And so if we have a better sense of what we have this year based on that soil test, then we can maybe make that decision and be more comfortable about, I think I'm okay cutting back maybe a little bit this year because I'm seeing some of this nitrogen being mineralized, right? And so that's an excellent point. One tool that we also have available. Like I say, when we start this conversation, I think we do have several things that we can control, I think, and these are the things that we need to be thinking about.
If we were going to try to even do it before the season began, suggestions, I guess, for, we run a lot of samples, we get a lot of information from a soil test, but talk about even profile nitrogen sampling or any of those sorts of things. How important are those, and when should they be done?
Yeah.
We talked about the in-season testing, but what about even pre-season testing?
Pre-season, for northeast Kansas, I think it has, especially if you have a reason to believe that there's extra nitrogen, it has a lot of value. But we talk about rain and the higher rainfall and so on. Chances of accumulating too much nitrogen is lower, right? We don't have as much chances of seeing a significant amount of nitrogen accumulating in the profile like we do as we go west in Kansas, right? As we keep going west, definitely that profile nitrogen becomes really, to me, the must have. We need to know that because we can have significant amount. For us in Northeast is maybe a little bit less value from that standpoint. But there are also other things. We haven't even talked about other nutrients, but we have nutrients like sulfur, for example. That's becoming pretty significant, very important. These are mobile nutrients that rely really on deep samples, right? We are not going to get good information on something like sulfur with a 6-inch sample, right? We really need to be looking at ideally a 24-inch sample for that kind of nutrients. And so if we are doing these already, we're looking at things like sulfur, yes, then we're also looking at nitrate, right? And then we're getting that full information from that standpoint pre-season, like you mentioned. And so we need to take advantage of that as well. Just because we are in Northeast, we're saying, well, we don't care about that. Well, there is potential, right? There is potential there, and so we need to consider that for sure.
Are there any other tools that you would consider? You hear about things on the market that, maybe snap a picture of a leaf or, any of those sorts of things. Are those well calibrated for making good nitrogen or other nutrient recommendations, or have you seen any of those tested to feel like they have some merit to them? It's a lot of work to go out and pull tissue samples during the middle of the growing season.
Yeah, and that's where things is a little tempting, right? That is there anything easier that we can use? And we have to be careful. I'm not saying those are not necessarily working. I think we have a lot of new technology that's being developed, but like you say, it's still being developed too, right? I mean, so I don't know that I've seen a lot of things out there. We tested research, independent research, and that you have history that farmers are using and really seeing the value. So that is one thing that I think we have to be open to all of those things, but we have to ask questions and we want to make sure we are putting the investment where it's going to really see the return.
Right.
Because it can be very tempting, right? You were talking about some of these things and say, hey, do this and you can save so much in fertilizer, especially this year. Hey, yeah, I want to do that.
Yeah, right.
But at the same time, we don't want to be, really end up being in trouble and affecting yields, and that's the worst thing we want, right? Tight budgets and low yields, that's not going to be good.
Bad combination, for sure.
Yeah.
So we've talked a little bit about, how we're going to come up with that rate. Part of our, nutrient stewardship program is a little bit then. Maybe the second thing is a little bit, talk about the right source. What should we be using out there for, so that we're not causing any more losses, we're not causing any more problems, we're not causing damage. Talk about what that might look like.
Yeah, that's a good point. Again, yes, we talk about time of application. We talk about the different the rates, and of course, again, the source is going to be a key factor, right? And we talk quite a bit about anhydrous ammonia. Anhydrous ammonia is a pretty stable form of nitrogen because we're putting is ammonium. Obviously, that ammonia is going to be stable. We're injecting that nitrogen, so just the product itself tends to be pretty good, right, in terms of stability in the soil. And efficiency potentially, especially we're putting it at the right time, right? If we're not putting too early and we don't have a warm winter months and things like that. So those are things that we need to be thinking about. Obviously, again, price is going to be a big factor here. What's going to be the best source of nitrogen price-wise, and also what's going to be, in terms of logistics, are maybe set up to do more liquid or dry. We need to keep those things in mind. There are going to be some products, we're talking about losses, we're talking urea versus, ammonium nitrate becomes available again in some cases. You guys can get ammonium nitrate. Those products are, remember ammonium nitrate, we don't have any volatilization losses, right? And if you have urea citrus, we have significant potential for volatilization losses. Right. And again, thinking about a budget this year, the last thing you want is to lose any pound of nitrogen. We want all of that nitrogen to be going into the crop and making yields. And so as we think in different sources, think about the pros and cons. Obviously, price is number one, right? But after that, what are some of the potential losses associated with each of these sources, right? Again, urea, we will have potentially volatilization. Things like ammonium nitrate is pretty stable form of nitrogen. Potential for losses are not there for volatilization, but then we can have some potential leaching, right? Because we have nitrate as being part of that. So we need to be thinking about these potential losses and the pros and cons. We're putting, thiosulfate, for example, with UAN. We know that thiosulfate has a little bit of activity in terms as a volatilization inhibitor, urease inhibitor, essentially. So minimize is not as good as urease inhibitors like MBPT, but it gives us some protection there, in addition to the sulfur, right? So be thinking about some of these pros and cons for each product,
right,
in addition to the price, right? Because that brings the next question is, if we have potential losses for volatilization, then we need to be thinking about that next step. Okay, how do we put this nitrogen, right?
Right.
So we need to be, if we're doing side dress, maybe we need to knife in, right, to avoid potential losses. Can we just dribble on the surface or broadcast? How is that going to work, and what are the risks? And that brings the other component to me really tight with the source is potential use of additives, right? And we do have products that works really well, again, especially urease inhibitors, MBPT products that can, very well tested, and we know it works pretty well.
Right.
Again, a year like this, I think, is something we need to be really considering to make sure we are protecting that nitrogen that we're putting there.
Okay.
Nitrification inhibitors, again, if we're talking about potential losses via leaching and denitrification, then that, using nitrification inhibitors are going to be, to me, is something that becomes more and more important, especially with again, the situation we are right now. Of course, one thing I want to emphasize with all of this, when we are getting a little bit more into the products, I think we are fortunate we have some really good products for nitrogen in particular. But make sure and we're using the right ones, right? Make sure we're using the ones that has been tested and we do have the data. And because there are also going to be some products out there that maybe has not been evaluated.
Right.
We don't know how it works, and we want to avoid that as much as possible. Like I say, I always think that we need to be trying new things. I think that's very important. But in a year like this, I think if we know something that's working, and we know we need it, I think better to go with that.
Right. So one of the questions I always get is, that we're putting a lot of our nitrogen on in a granular form, typically, over the top of that crop when we're just barely able to get across it anyway. You get the argument that, well, it's not really doing nearly as much good as it would if I could dribble down and maybe even split and dribble right at the base of that plant. Thoughts on, does that, what is the value of being able to dribble right at the surface, or can we really just, as long as we can get it down there and keep it from being lost, that is our primary focus? Is there differences there that we ought to consider?
Yeah, there are some differences, right? And I think, dry on top, it could be as good as anything. But there's one potential risk that we didn't talk about yet is the potential for maybe some tie-up that may happen.
Yep.
Right, and if we have good residue, which we want to have some good residue out there, we're putting dry on top, some of that may actually be going on top of that residue that's high carbon, and that may actually tie up some of that nitrogen. So if we're dribbling, and especially with doing something like wide drops where we're putting right at the base of that corn, obviously we're putting right there, we're minimizing contact with potential residue. Oftentimes that will tend to be more efficient, especially if we're dealing with higher residue situation. But having said that, we also have situations where we just don't have a lot of residue there.
Absolutely.
Right? And so in that case, I don't think it's going to make a difference.
Okay.
And we're seeing that all the time too, that it makes no difference at all.
A lot of times our soybean residue is gone.
It's gone, yes.
By that time of the season, and
Yes,
so
yes.
not much
Not
left out there.
Not much there, but especially if we have corn after corn or something like that, then that's where that placement and putting right at the base of that corn can make a difference. Yes.
Okay. So you talked about other nutrients as well. Are there other nutrients that we ought to be considering? Obviously, we run into those situations where we note a deficiency or something along those lines. But how should we be evaluating those in season? What's the best way to go about doing that? Does that go back to that tissue test at that
Tissue
point.
testing will be one key tool for sure, and that's the good thing about that is that we've been talking more about nitrogen, but the realities work very well for P and K and sulfur and micros. We can get that information by doing tissue testing, and in fact for some of those nutrients, tissue testing is actually much better than soil testing, and so we'll get much better information from doing that. One thing that I just mentioned earlier that I want to just touch on this a little bit is sulfur. And sulfur and nitrogen, they kind of go together.
Right.
And so that's one thing I like to emphasize a little bit more because it's just becoming pretty much expected that we'll need sulfur in our cropping systems. I want to say 15 years ago that was not very common, but today it's pretty common to see sulfur needs. And we did talk about in-season application of nitrogen.
Right.
Nitrogen, sulfur is just like nitrogen. It's mobile, right? We're putting, say, a liquid ammonium thiosulfate, maybe going with UAN. That would be the ideal time to do it. It would be to be putting that with that nitrogen. So if we're doing side dressing nitrogen with liquid, that would be the perfect time to also go ahead and put some sulfur.
Okay.
And so we need to know where we are there. I mentioned earlier doing soil testing, that's going to help us. Tissue testing based on historical numbers. Do we have any history that shows that we've been short of sulfur? We need to be thinking about that as well, and take advantage of that nitrogen application to also go ahead and apply some sulfur. I think is the ideal timing and combination.
Okay.
But also, again, if you're thinking about increased nitrogen use efficiency overall, we need to really be thinking about other nutrients as well. Oftentimes, it seems like we're putting everything, we focus so much on the nitrogen, and we have other deficiencies there that are limiting the use of nitrogen. We don't want to be in that situation also.
Right.
And so I completely agree. We need to be looking at the whole picture as well. Make sure we are covering the needs on other nutrients as well.
Okay. You talked a little bit about maybe some of the additives or or not so much the additives, but maybe the biologicals or different products. Is there any, as we look at those products, there's a lot of them on the market. Any of them that you have seen so far that maybe kind of, hey, this really has some hope. This really has something that we need to consider. Maybe this isn't the year to consider it, but looking forward possibly.
Well, we've done some research on looking at some of the biologicals. There's just so much of them.
Sure.
Right? And so that's a challenge. We cannot look at all of them, right? There are some, the ones that I've seen out there in the market, I always been very skeptical about these things.
Right.
But one thing that is clear to me is that the research is been really good, and there's really good potential there. I've seen some good things there. I'm still struggling to actually see significant yield benefits.
Right.
And some of our research that shows that some of the biological products providing some activity, for example, early season, you get to see higher concentration of nitrogen in the tissue, maybe better growth early in the season. But then at the time when we measure yields, I don't see any difference.
Right.
And so that's, I think, where we are still. And so I think that's something to keep in mind. One thing that I also see, and I hear quite a bit from producers, is that seems like there's not consistency, right? And I think we still need to learn a lot about what are the conditions, what are the soils and conditions where we can see more benefit from things like biologicals.
Sure.
We have a lot to learn there.
Right.
Again, I think it's potential there. I just don't know if that is. I think a year like this, we need to go after the low-hanging fruit, things where we know for sure we're gonna get some benefits. And these biologicals, I think, is a potential, but I haven't seen the consistency that I think we like to see for something to be implemented, widely in our production systems.
Absolutely. So this feels like it might be, these nitrogen prices, the margins that we're looking at right now, feels like it might be maybe a longer term thing than we'd like to hope. Talk, if you will, about 10,000 foot view, looking forward, what we ought to be doing as we head even towards the end of this growing season into the next growing season. What are those things that we ought to be doing to kind of maybe better manage that fertilizer dollar?
I think we talk about some of those things already that we should be doing, David, and I agree. I think some of these things are not new, right? The things that we're talking about is we can already know that we have the data now to really show that some of the increase in efficiency, agronomic efficiency, which also translate into economic efficiency, right? And so I think some of those things that we need to be thinking about. Long term, I mentioned several things that you may not see it in 1 or 2 years, but you really see it in 5 or even 10 years. I think to me it's really a situation like this, maybe the main thing is for all of us is really bring the point that we need to be looking at our programs specifically.
Yes.
And what can we do better? I know out there some producers are doing great already. I mean, there's really very little room. I mean, so efficient system that they're running. I'm always impressed. Some of these systems that some producers that are running that is very high efficiency.
Right.
And so, and especially in corn, we are doing pretty well already, right? But there are many out there that still can continue to increase and improve efficiency. And so that's really something that each person going to have to evaluate. Let's look at my program. Where are my places where maybe weaker points that I can maybe improve? I think that's the evaluation we need to be looking at moving forward. One thing that I have to say is that, and I mentioned this, it's not the first time we're dealing with this situation.
Right, absolutely.
I mean, we have this situation of high price fertilizer prices before and considering the challenges, especially in corn. Corn is a highly responsive crop to nitrogen, right? So we just have to be careful not to focus too much also on, being too aggressive in terms of cutting back that we're affecting yields, right?
Absolutely.
And so before doing that, before cutting back too aggressively, to me it's always the question, let's evaluate how are we doing this management, nitrogen management. Can we increase agronomic efficiency before we cutting back on rates? In other words, can we have more yield with the same rate of nitrogen that we're putting? I think that's something that we need to evaluate for sure. Because it's so sensitive to nitrogen deficiency, we have to just be careful that we're not being too aggressive in cutting backs.
With the ability we have now too, the equipment that we have, the ability we have to maybe even do some fairly easy variable rate sort of stuff, it's a good time to trial some stuff as well and see how things respond on your own farm.
We haven't even talked about variable rate, right?
Right.
And that is one aspect as well that, we know there's variability in the field. How can we take advantage of that variability in terms of, okay, let's provide, we have, areas in the field that we know is high yielding.
Right.
How we can give everything we can to that area to really bring the average up, right? There are parts of the field that's really not much you can do, right?
Right.
It's always going to be lower yielding and whatever, other challenges there. Just by putting more nitrogen is not going to help.
Sure.
But how can we bring those high potential areas higher? And that's the key of variable rate, right? And that may be just management zones, or we don't have to really get very specific there. Sometimes it's just splitting that field in 2 or 3.
Right.
That's where you may get most of your return. So be thinking about those options as well. I think is kind of that next step.
Perfect. Dorivar, thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you.